When I started learning English, I didn't even know how to say hello properly. My accent was strange, my words were broken, and my confidence was nowhere to be found. But I had one thing, a burning curiosity. I wanted to understand the world beyond my window. I wanted to talk to people, to hear their stories, and to tell mine. That curiosity became my teacher. When I first decided to learn English alone, I didn't even know how to say hello properly. Every time I tried, my tongue stumbled over the words, my accent sounded strange, and I felt awkward. People around me sometimes laughed, not to hurt me, but because it sounded so unusual. At that moment, I could have given up. Many would have given up, but I had a spark inside me, a curiosity that could not be silenced. I wanted to understand the world beyond my small city, beyond the news I read in my language, beyond the limited stories that I could access. That curiosity became my teacher, my guide, and my companion. It gave me a reason to wake up every morning and face the challenge of a language that seemed impossible at first. I realized very early that the journey of learning English would not be measured in days or months, but in small, steady steps taken every single day. I had no fancy textbooks, no online courses, no expensive tutors. All I had were a few old cassette tapes that I borrowed, a small stack of magazines that I could barely understand, and a radio that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Even when I couldn't understand a single word, I listened. I listened to the news, to songs, to conversations on the radio. Every sound was a mystery, but every sound was also a lesson. I would repeat words over and over again, even if I didn't know what they meant. I believed that one day these sounds would start making sense, and they did. Patience became my friend. Repetition became my habit. I learned that learning a language is not about instant understanding, but about persistence, about being willing to fail thousands of times and still continue. In the beginning, my English was terrible. My pronunciation was awkward, my sentences were broken, and I often mixed up words in ways that made people smile or laugh. At first, I felt embarrassed, but then I realized something important. If you are afraid of being laughed at, you will never speak, you will never learn. So I laughed with them, and then I laughed at myself, and then I kept speaking anyway. Every mistake became a stepping stone, every awkward sentence a lesson in courage. I began to see failure not as a roadblock, but as the path itself. The more I stumbled, the more I learned. I started practicing out loud in my own room. I described everything around me in English. The furniture, the objects, even the weather. This is my cup. That is the window. The sun is shining. At first it felt strange, even silly, talking to myself as if I were teaching an invisible audience. But gradually, I noticed something extraordinary. I was beginning to think in English. When you start thinking in a language, you stop translating from your mother tongue. You stop being a beginner. You start living the language. You start seeing the world through new eyes, and everything becomes a lesson waiting to be learned. I also realized the importance of learning from people. I could read all the books, listen to all the tapes, but nothing taught me as much as conversation with someone else. I sought out travelers, foreigners, people who could speak English better than I could. I listened to their stories, copied their expressions, imitated their tone, and sometimes failed terribly. But each interaction taught me something new. English is not just grammar and vocabulary. It is culture. It is emotion. It is the way people think. It is understanding not just what they say, but why they say it. By observing, listening, and speaking, I began to feel the rhythm of the language, the heartbeat of its people. There were many moments when I wanted to give up. Learning alone felt lonely. There was no one to encourage me every day, no teacher to pat my shoulder, no friend to practice with at all times. But then I understood a simple truth: the person who can motivate you the most is yourself. You cannot wait for others to push you forward. You are your own teacher, your own competitor, and your own source of inspiration. I set small goals: learning 5 new words a day, writing 1 paragraph a week, reading a short article every evening. Brick by brick, day by day, I was building a foundation that no one could take away from me. I remember the day when I watched an English movie without subtitles for the first time. I understood the dialogues, I caught the jokes, I even felt the emotions of the characters. That moment was not just a sign that I could understand English. It was proof of patience, persistence, and belief in myself. It was proof that learning alone is not weakness. It is strength in disguise. Every day of practice, every mistake, every awkward conversation had prepared me for that day. I also discovered that teaching others was a powerful tool for growth. When I started helping friends and peers practice English, I realized that the act of teaching made me even better. To explain, to demonstrate, to answer questions forced me to understand more deeply. Sharing knowledge made learning more alive. Language became not just a skill, but a bridge connecting people, a tool for influence, a way to inspire. When I began learning English alone at home, I didn't have confidence. Every time I opened my mouth, I feared making mistakes. Sometimes I would say a word completely wrong, and people around me would laugh. Not cruelly, but naturally. At first, I felt embarrassed, but I realized that embarrassment was actually a sign that I was growing. I learned early on that the secret to learning anything alone is to embrace imperfection. If you wait to be perfect, you will never start. The journey begins with curiosity and courage, not with skill. I wanted to understand the world, to connect with people beyond my own city, and to see life from a wider perspective. That desire became my fuel. Every day, no matter how tired I felt, I reminded myself that small steps every day are what lead to mastery. I had no expensive courses or tutors. I had no one guiding me step by step. What I had were simple resources, old magazines I could barely read, a tiny dictionary, and a radio that sometimes worked. I listened to English programs even when I could understand nothing. I repeated sentences, tried to mimic accents, and copied words even if I didn't know their exact meaning. At first, it felt pointless. I would sit for hours, listening and speaking, and feel like I wasn't learning anything. But slowly, my ears began to recognize sounds, my mouth began to form words more naturally, and my brain started to associate meaning with the words I repeated. Learning alone teaches patience. It teaches you that progress is not always visible, but every small effort counts. My first conversations were painful. I mixed up words, pronounced things incorrectly, and sometimes said things that made no sense at all. People would smile at me not to hurt me, but because I sounded so awkward. At first, I was frustrated. I wanted to give up. Then, I realized that mistakes are not enemies. They are the path to success. Every mistake is a lesson. Every mispronounced word is a reminder that you are learning. I began to welcome mistakes. I would say to myself, if you are not embarrassed, you are not learning. Embarrassment becomes energy if you let it. It becomes a push to speak louder, try harder, and never stop. I discovered a key secret: you must learn from people, not just from books. I sought out anyone who spoke English better than I did. I asked questions. I listened to their stories. I imitated their expressions, their gestures, their tone. Real learning happens when you engage with others, not just when you study alone. Language is not about memorizing rules. It is about understanding people. It is about observing how they communicate, how they express emotions, how they think. This lesson changed my approach completely. I stopped trying to memorize everything perfectly and started trying to feel the language. I also realized that learning alone requires discipline and consistency. Every day I set small goals. I would learn a few new words, write a paragraph, or watch a short video. Some days I felt tired or discouraged, but I never skipped the practice. I knew that mastery is built brick by brick, day by day. It is not about genius or talent. It is about persistence. I learned that most people give up too soon. They think that learning should be easy or immediate. But the truth is, mastery takes time, patience, and relentless effort. One of the most powerful lessons I learned is that teaching accelerates learning. When I began helping friends practice English, I realized that explaining concepts forced me to understand them better. I had to articulate clearly, find examples, and correct mistakes, not just for them, but for myself. Teaching turned my learning into action, and action is the fastest way to internalize knowledge. Sharing what you know also gives purpose to your effort. Language is no longer a personal goal. It becomes a tool to connect, inspire, and create opportunities. Over time, I started noticing progress. I could watch English movies and understand the dialogues. I could write letters and emails without struggling. I could communicate ideas clearly. The journey transformed not only my English, but my confidence, my patience, and my approach to learning anything in life. I realized that mastering a skill alone is not just about knowledge. It is about character, persistence, and self-belief. I learned to celebrate small victories, to laugh at mistakes, and to keep moving forward even when progress seemed invisible. When I first decided to learn English at home, I did not have a plan, a teacher, or even confidence. I only had curiosity, a desire to connect with the world, and a stubborn belief that I could improve if I tried hard enough. At the beginning, I struggled with even the simplest words. My pronunciation was terrible, my sentences were broken, and every conversation felt like climbing a mountain with no map. People laughed at my mistakes sometimes, and at first I felt ashamed. But then I realized that embarrassment is actually a gift. It tells you that you are stepping outside your comfort zone, and growth happens only when you are willing to feel uncomfortable. I learned early that if you want to achieve something meaningful, you must be ready to face failure, to stumble, and to keep moving forward. I didn't have access to expensive resources. I had no online courses, no language apps, and no tutor waiting for me every day. All I had were a few old books, some English magazines, a small radio, and my own voice. I started listening to English broadcasts even when I could understand nothing. I would repeat words, imitate accents, and read aloud, even when I felt awkward. It felt useless at first, but slowly I noticed patterns in the sounds, meanings behind the words, and connections that started to make sense. Learning alone teaches patience like nothing else. It forces you to trust the process, to celebrate small improvements, and to understand that mastery is built through persistent effort, not instant results. At first, speaking in English was frightening. Every word I said could be wrong. I mispronounced words, I used the wrong grammar, and sometimes what I tried to say made no sense at all. I could feel the eyes of people when I spoke, and I could feel my own hesitation. But I soon realized a simple truth. If you are afraid of mistakes, you will never speak, and if you never speak, you will never learn. So I embraced the mistakes. I laughed at myself, I laughed with others, and then I kept trying. Every misstep became a lesson, every awkward sentence became practice. I learned to turn embarrassment into energy, to see failure as a teacher rather than an enemy. I discovered that learning from people is even more powerful than learning from books. I started meeting travelers, foreigners, and people who spoke English fluently. I listened to their stories, observed their gestures, copied their expressions, and tried to understand their way of thinking. Language is not just about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. It is about understanding people, their culture, their emotions, and their perspective. Engaging with others teaches lessons that no textbook ever can. By practicing with real people, I learned not only words but confidence, expression, and creativity. Discipline became another key to my success. Every day I set small goals, 5 new words, a short paragraph, listening to a song or a news broadcast. Some days I was tired, frustrated, or distracted, but I never skipped practice. I knew that consistency mattered more than brilliance. Mastery is the result of tiny steps repeated relentlessly. Most people give up too soon because they expect instant results. But learning, especially alone, is a long game. You must trust the process and keep moving, even when progress seems invisible. Another lesson I learned is that teaching accelerates learning. When I began helping friends practice English, I realized that explaining what I had learned forced me to understand it more deeply. I had to articulate, clearly answer questions, and find examples, and in the process, I internalized my own learning. Sharing knowledge gives purpose to the struggle, and purpose turns effort into passion. Language becomes not just a personal skill, but a bridge to connect with others, a tool to inspire, and a way to grow together. Over time, my confidence grew. I could watch movies without subtitles, read articles without difficulty, and express my ideas clearly. Learning alone had not only improved my English, but had transformed my mindset. I learned patience, resilience, and self-reliance. I celebrated small victories, embraced mistakes, and kept pushing forward, knowing that persistence is more important than perfection, and courage is more valuable than comfort. When I first began learning English on my own, I had nothing but curiosity and determination. I did not know the rules, I did not know the vocabulary, and I certainly did not know if I would ever become fluent. Every day felt like stepping into a world I did not understand. The first time I tried to speak, my tongue stumbled over the simplest words, my sentences were broken, and people sometimes smiled at my mistakes. At first, I felt embarrassed and frustrated. I thought maybe I was not smart enough. Maybe I would never succeed. But then I realized something important. The people who succeed are not always the most talented. They are the ones who refuse to give up. Curiosity and persistence can overcome fear and doubt. And that became the principle I lived by. I had no formal teacher, no online course, no structured program. What I had were a few old magazines, a small radio, and my own voice. I listened, repeated, mimicked, and read aloud every day, even when it felt meaningless. I listened to English broadcasts that I could not understand, and I wrote down words I did not know. I made mistakes constantly, but every mistake became a lesson. Slowly, the sounds began to make sense, the words began to connect, and my brain started to recognize patterns. Learning alone teaches patience. It teaches you to trust the process and to celebrate small improvements that others might not even notice. Speaking English was the most challenging part. Every word could be wrong. I would mispronounce words, mix up tenses, and form sentences that made no sense at all. People sometimes laughed, and sometimes they just looked at me as if I were confused. At first, it was painful. Then I realized that embarrassment is not an enemy, it is a teacher. Every time you speak, even if it is wrong, you grow. Every mistake is a stepping stone toward mastery. I learned to embrace my mistakes, to laugh at myself, and to keep speaking anyway. Courage is more important than perfection, and persistence is more valuable than natural talent. One of the most important lessons I learned is that learning from people is more effective than learning alone. I found anyone who could speak English fluently. Travelers, colleagues, friends, and I listened carefully. I copied their expressions, observed their gestures, and tried to understand how they thought. Language is not just a set of rules or words. It is culture, emotion, and perspective. Engaging with real people teaches lessons that no textbook can provide. It teaches you to express yourself, to adapt, and to think creatively. Conversation is the laboratory where language comes alive, and mistakes in conversation are the experiments that teach you the most. Consistency became another key to my progress. I set small, achievable goals, 5 new words every day, a paragraph of writing, a short news article, or a few minutes of listening. Some days I was tired, discouraged, or distracted, but I never skipped practice. Mastery is built one small step at a time. Many people quit too soon because they expect quick results. But the truth is that learning anything meaningful takes patience, persistence, and relentless effort. The process itself builds character, discipline, and resilience. I also discovered that teaching is one of the fastest ways to learn. When I began helping others practice English, I realized that explaining what I had learned forced me to understand it more deeply. I had to organize my thoughts, answer questions, and correct mistakes, which strengthened my own knowledge. Sharing your learning makes it purposeful. Language becomes not just a skill, but a tool for connection, influence, and growth. Over time, I noticed a transformation. I could watch English movies and understand the dialogues, read articles without difficulty, and express my ideas with clarity. Learning alone had changed more than my English. It had changed my mindset. I became patient, resilient, and confident. I celebrated small victories, laughed at mistakes, and kept moving forward. I realized that mastery is not about being perfect. It is about persistence, courage, and the willingness to keep going when no one is watching. Learning alone teaches you independence, self-belief, and the value of never giving up. And these lessons are far more powerful than any grammar rule or vocabulary list. When I first began learning English at home, I had almost nothing to rely on. I did not have a teacher, I did not have expensive materials, and I did not even have confidence in my ability to succeed. All I had was curiosity and a stubborn determination to understand the world beyond my small city. Every day felt like stepping into unknown territory. At first I could barely form sentences. My pronunciation was awkward, my grammar was confusing, and every attempt at conversation made me feel clumsy. People sometimes laughed at my mistakes, and I would have felt discouraged if I had not realized that embarrassment is actually a sign of progress. Every mistake tells you that you are learning, that you are trying, and that you are moving forward. I discovered early that the most important thing is to keep going, even when you feel lost, because persistence often matters more than talent. I had no formal lessons, no structured programs, and no guidance. What I had were old magazines, a small radio, and my own voice. I listened to English broadcasts that I could barely understand. I repeated words over and over again, and I read sentences aloud even when they made no sense to me. At first, it felt frustrating and slow. I would sit for hours, unsure if I was making any progress. But gradually, patterns started to emerge. The words began to make sense, my pronunciation improved, and I began to understand not just the meaning of words, but the rhythm and emotion behind them. Learning alone teaches patience and persistence. It teaches you to trust the process and to focus on progress rather than perfection. Speaking English for the first time was terrifying. Every word could be wrong. I mispronounced words, confused tenses, and formed sentences that often made no sense at all. People would smile politely or chuckle, and I felt ashamed. But then I realized that mistakes are not obstacles, they are lessons. Every wrong word, every failed sentence is a step forward. I learned to embrace my mistakes and use them as fuel. I laughed at myself, I laughed with others, and I continued speaking. Courage is more important than perfection, and persistence is more valuable than natural talent. I also learned that learning from people is far more effective than learning alone. I sought out anyone who spoke English better than I did. I listened to their stories, watched their expressions, and tried to understand how they thought. Language is not just about grammar and vocabulary, it is about culture, emotion, and perspective. Conversing with real people teaches lessons that no textbook can provide. It teaches you to express yourself, to adapt, and to communicate with clarity and empathy. Real conversations create real growth, and even mistakes in conversation are opportunities to learn faster than any practice alone. Consistency became my secret weapon. Every day I set small, manageable goals, 5 new words, a short paragraph, a news article, or a few minutes of listening practice. Some days were frustrating. Some days I felt tired or distracted, but I never gave up. I learned that mastery is not about brilliance or talent. It is about small, repeated actions over time. Most people quit too soon because they expect instant results. The truth is that learning anything valuable takes patience, persistence, and dedication. Each day of effort, no matter how small, builds momentum and strengthens character. Another revelation came when I began teaching others. Helping friends practice English forced me to explain clearly, organize my thoughts, and correct mistakes. Teaching made me accountable, and accountability accelerated my learning. Sharing knowledge gave my effort purpose. Language became more than just a skill. It became a tool to connect, to inspire, and to grow together. Every time I helped someone else learn, I reinforced my own understanding and discovered new ways to improve. Gradually, I noticed the transformation. I could watch movies and understand the dialogues without subtitles. I could read articles without stopping every few words. I could communicate my thoughts clearly and confidently. Learning alone had not only improved my English, but it had changed my mindset. I became patient, resilient, and self-reliant. I learned to celebrate small victories, to embrace mistakes, and to keep moving forward even when progress seemed invisible. I realized that true mastery is not about being perfect, it is about persistence, courage, and self-belief. Learning alone teaches independence, discipline, and the strength to continue even when no one is watching, and these lessons are far more valuable than any language skill.